help you?
Hi, can I get a cheeseburger Happy Meal, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
What's the toy?
I don't know.
Oh.
Figure that out.
All right, that's exciting. All right.
Have a great evening, guys.
Thank you as well.
Hey, gal.
Hi, my name's Damien, and you may recognize me probably in a drive-thru, or maybe if it's open, you may have seen me in the dining area. That's not important. People who know me know that I am not a fan of tardiness. I prefer punctuality. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a certain time frame, a certain grace period that people have, but I like to be as punctual as possible. And again, I understand. Sometimes things happen. Life gets in the way. I've been tardy a few times myself. But the thing is, if you are consistently late, that's not life getting in the way. That's you. Get your act together. When I was in university, I had a choir director who was fond of saying, to be early is to be on time. To be on time is to be late, and to be late is unthinkable. Now, of course, people who may remember me from junior high or high school may say, but Damien, you were often late to school. You were regularly late to class. Why the issue about tardiness now? To which I say, it's simple. Back then, I didn't care. See, when you care, that's when you put forth the effort. Besides, that was a long time ago. Why you got to bring up old stuff? It is possible for people to change. It's possible for people to grow for the better. Sometimes, perhaps in an attempt for self-justification, my lateness-loving friends will say something along the lines like, well, you know, Jesus was late sometimes. Let's just get this out of the way right now. Just because God doesn't work on your time frame and your time schedule doesn't mean that he's late. At most, I prefer to think of it as a divine dilatoriousness. In John, the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 11, we read that Jesus was out doing his thing with his boys, the disciples, when he gets word that one of his very best friends, Lazarus, is deathly ill. But rather than going immediately to heal Lazarus, or even just giving the word so that Lazarus will be made well, Jesus decides to camp out for a few days. When they do eventually make it into the small town of Bethany, which is where Lazarus was living with two of his sisters, the disciples find out that Lazarus, by that time, had been dead and buried, put in a tomb for 4 days already. They get to the house where there's a lot of people, and they're all mourning with Mary and Martha over their loss, over the loss of their brother. And Martha comes outside. She hears Jesus has finally arrived. And she goes outside. She meets Jesus. And Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus reminds Martha to hold on tight to her faith. And Martha assures her that she is holding on to her faith. And she knows that her brother Lazarus, he's going to live for eternity in heaven. And right about there is where we get that famous short verse, John 11:35. Jesus wept. Then Mary, she comes outside and she sees her sister Martha with Jesus. She kneels down before Jesus and she says basically the same thing that Martha did. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And then they go over to the cemetery. They go over to the tomb and there's a big stone that is blocking the entrance to the tomb. And Jesus tells them to move that stone. And you got to keep in mind, this was a hot desert climate. This was way before formaldehyde. Lazarus had been in that tomb for 4 days already, decomposing. So Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days. I prefer the King James translation of that verse. Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believed?" So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so that they will believe that you sent me." Then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." That would have been a pretty amazing miracle to witness. And keep in mind, when Jesus brought Lazarus back from the dead, he didn't bring him back as a zombie or any such silliness like that. When he brought Lazarus back from the dead, he brought Lazarus back complete. He brought Lazarus back whole. Death can seem pretty final. There's no doubt about that. But it isn't necessarily the end. Now, I can't promise that Jesus will bring back all your loved ones from the dead. That's not the point of this miracle. The point is to prove that Jesus has authority over life and death, and that what he says can be counted on. And one of the things that he says is that if you hold on to faith in him, death is not the end. There's something more that awaits us. But that's not actually the point I want to focus on today. As much as it might pain me to say this, as much as I prefer punctuality and not tardiness, the thing everyone needs to hear today is this. With Jesus, it's never too late. Jesus chose to camp out for a few days before going to Bethany. He chose to exercise his divine dilatoriousness, not because he didn't care, but because he did care. He loved them. He wanted them to be a part of a greater miracle. He wanted them to be a part of a greater blessing. Now, that might be a tough thing for us to wrap our minds around, but it's true. And maybe today you're waiting on the Lord to act in response to some of your fervent prayers. You need to remember that he's not too late. And you need to remember that, as for us, generally speaking, as long as you still have breath, it's not too late for you to go to Jesus either. I grew up Roman Catholic. And a story that I often love to tell about having grown up Roman Catholic has to do with our Lenten traditions. Lent, of course, being the 40 days before Easter. Now, the way that my mother had us do it was that during Lent, we didn't eat red meat. We would eat chicken or fish. Especially on Fridays, we would only eat fish. And my mother didn't take us to McDonald's very often. We'd get a lot of home-cooked meals, for which I'm very grateful for. But when she would take us to McDonald's, it seemed like she would only take us to McDonald's during Lent, and on Fridays to boot. So what would bother me about that is that all these good little Protestant boys and girls, they'd be there just mowing down on their cheeseburger Happy Meals or their chicken McNugget Happy Meals, and my sister Jessica and I, we'd have to get the Filet-O-Fish. And in all fairness, the Filet-O-Fish may be a delicious fish. It may be the best fish sandwich on earth, but I'll never know because I'm never going to order that thing again. And what made it worse, really, was that there was no Filet-O-Fish Happy Meal. If anyone is watching from McDonald's, that's an oversight you have to fix immediately. So there I was, 2013, 2014. I was visiting my mother. And whenever I visit my mother, there's always a few meals that she knows to make for me, a few meals that I like that she makes. And one of my favorite meals that my mother makes are her chicken enchiladas. I love her chicken enchiladas. And Mom, when I come down there again, you know I expect that. And this time was no different. We were going to have chicken enchiladas that night, but we were missing a few of the key ingredients. And so I took my mother to the grocery store. We picked up what she needed. And then she said she was thirsty, and so we loaded up her car, and then we walked across the parking lot to the other end where there was a McDonald's. And it was those dollar drink days. I don't know if they still have them, but you can get any size fountain drink you want for just $1. And so we go in, my mother gets an iced tea, a large iced tea for $1. I get whatever drink I got for $1. And then my mother asked the gal behind the counter for a Happy Meal, and I didn't think anything of it, really. I figured maybe she just wanted a snack. And like I said, I didn't think anything of it until the gal behind the counter asked my mother, do you want the Happy Meal for a boy or the Happy Meal for a girl? And my mother said, for a boy. And when she got the Happy Meal, she picked it up and handed it to me and said, here, now you have to forgive me. As a child, I may have been a little upset about the whole Filet-O-Fish Happy Meal issue. But the fact is, I got over that years ago. I've been over that for a long time. And as another matter of fact, I still practice Lent to this day, and I practice it the way that I was taught as a young Roman Catholic. I give up red meat. And that is really hard for me because I love red meat a lot. But that's part of the sacrifice of Lent. And so I thought it was sweet, kind of funny that my mother, all these years later, into my adulthood, would give me a Happy Meal. And as I was laughing about it, I told her, I was like, Mom, I'm going to have to use this in a sermon somehow. And I had no idea how I'd work it into a message. I had no idea when I would work it into a message, but I reassured her, Mom, I am going to put this in a message somehow. And my mother, she said, just be sure to tell the people it's never too late. And I looked at her and said, what do you mean? It's never too late for what, Mom? And she said, tell the people it's never too late to look back and try to make things better. Earlier in the Gospel according to St. John, we read about how a large crowd of people had gathered around Jesus, over 5,000, and they were there to hear Jesus preach, and they were there to ask him to perform miraculous miracles, mostly healings. It gets late, and the only food available happens to be the lunch that a little boy brought with him. Just a few pieces of bread and a couple of fish. And I don't know if there was any toy involved in his lunch sack, but I like to imagine it was kind of an ancient Happy Meal. And so he gives Jesus the meal, and Jesus miraculously multiplies the meal, so much so that everyone, remember there were over 5,000 people, everyone had their fill. And he multiplied it so much that there were even several large basketfuls of food left over. In John 6:12 we read, and when they were satisfied, he said to his disciples, gather the remaining food so that nothing is lost. And then I found this commentary on that passage. There are some people who go out to clubs and parties week after week, night after night, and for many of those people, they're never satisfied. They always want more of whatever they're looking for, but they don't realize that only Jesus can truly satisfy. There are those who self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, often trying to numb some pain in their life. But before long, they need more. Jesus can heal that pain. Only Jesus can satisfy. There are those who go from partner to partner, longing for compassion, longing for companionship, but they keep switching without love. Only Jesus can satisfy. But the catch is this. You can't just take a little sample. You've got to take in as much as you need until you're full. A nibble of bread and a bite of fish won't satisfy any hunger. Jesus didn't put a limit on what we could take of his offer. Therefore, take until you are ready to burst. My dad loves to cook, but he doesn't like to just cook a little bit of food. My dad loves to put on a big spread and have a large gathering. He loves having people over to eat his food. And it's good food, I gotta admit. And after my dad has cooked, after he's told everyone to help themselves, my dad is often fond of using this expression. He loves to say, if you snooze, you lose. Now what he means by that is if you're going through and getting food on your plate and you hesitate, thinking, well, maybe I'll come back later. If it's not there later, that's your fault. You snooze, you lose. He also means that if you happen to show up late to the table and there's no food left over, that's your fault. You snooze, you lose. But that's not how Jesus does things. See, Jesus could have made exactly the right amount for all the people who were there. But he didn't do that. He did make the right amount for all the people that were there, but then he went over and above. He made enough food for the people, and there were 12 large basketfuls of food that was left over. Now, what that says to me is that if perhaps you hesitated on your opportunity earlier, or maybe if you're late coming to the table as it is, you can still go to Jesus and you can still get what you need. It's never too late with Jesus. No matter how long the delay, no matter how deep the despair, it's never too late for Jesus to work his resurrection power in your life. And Mom, yes, I do still have the toy for my Happy Meal. Oh, I loved growing up Roman Catholic. One of my favorite things about going to Mass was that you always knew what to expect. You knew when to stand, when to sit, when to kneel. And you always knew all the words to the songs, to the chants. You know, it's like, Sana, sana, colita de rana, that only makes sense if you speak Spanish and grew up Catholic. I don't know why I even bothers. We'll cut that.